The forest was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt peaceful. Not the kind that made a man want to sit down and breathe slowly. It was the kind of silence that pressed against a person from all sides, the kind that made the hairs on the back of the neck stand up for no clear reason. Birds did not sing. Leaves did not rustle. Even the wind seemed to have stopped moving, as if it was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. Garrett noticed all of it. He was not the kind of man who spoke much. He was not the kind of man who laughed loudly or told long stories around the fire at camp. He was steady and quiet and careful, and those three things had kept him alive through more bad situations than he liked to count. He moved through the ruins of the old forest outpost with slow, deliberate steps, his boots pressing softly against ash and broken stone. The outpost had been destroyed weeks ago. Nobody lived here anymore. The wooden walls had burned down to black stumps. The storage buildings had collapsed inward. What remained was a skeleton of a place, full of shadows and the smell of old smoke and damp earth. His orders were simple. Walk the ruins. Check for enemy movement. Return to camp before dark. He had done this kind of patrol before. Many times. But something felt different tonight. He could not explain it. There was no clear reason for the feeling sitting low in his chest, the feeling that told him to slow down and pay attention. He trusted that feeling. It had never been wrong. He stepped over a cracked wall and moved deeper into the ruins, scanning each shadow carefully. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. He was almost ready to turn back toward the eastern trail when he heard it. It was a small sound. Very soft. Low in pitch and quiet, like something crying but too tired to cry properly. It was not a sound he recognized at first. It did not belong to any bird or animal he knew. But it was coming from somewhere close, behind a collapsed section of stone wall near what had once been the supply room. Garrett stopped walking. He stood still for a moment, just listening. The sound came again. Small and weak and sad. He moved toward it slowly, not reaching for his rifle, not rushing. He pushed aside a chunk of broken stone with his boot and crouched down low, peering into the narrow gap between the rubble and the collapsed wall. What he saw made him go completely still. It was a drake. He had heard of them. Seen drawings of them in old books back at base. But he had never seen one this close, and he had certainly never seen one this small. It was young, no bigger than a large dog, covered from head to tail in dark gray scales that caught the last thin light of the evening and shimmered faintly blue. Its wings were folded against its body, except for one, which was pinned under a heavy fallen beam and bent at a painful angle. Its eyes were open and fixed on him. They were amber, bright and deep, like two small flames burning steadily inside its head. It made that sound again. Garrett exhaled slowly through his nose. The creature was trapped. It was hurt. It was scared. And it was looking at him the way small things looked at large things when they had no more strength left to run. He set his rifle down carefully within arm's reach, then gripped the fallen beam with both hands. It was thick and heavy and waterlogged from days of rain, and it did not want to move. Garrett planted his boots firmly, tightened his grip, and pulled. His shoulders burned. His jaw locked. The beam shifted a little, then a little more, and then with a rough scraping sound it rolled to the side and thumped against the ground. The drake pulled its wing free immediately, trembling with the effort. The wing hung at a wrong angle. Hurt, maybe broken. But the creature was free now, and it sat there on the cold ground looking up at him with those amber eyes and did not run. Garrett crouched down to its level. He reached slowly into his pack and pulled out his water canteen. He poured a small amount into his cupped palm and held it out, low and open, the way you would offer something to a frightened animal that had no reason yet to trust you. He did not move fast. He did not speak. He just held his hand out and waited. The drake looked at his hand for a long moment. Then it leaned forward and drank. Something quiet happened inside Garrett's chest when it did that. He could not name it properly. It was not pity. It was something older than pity. It was the feeling a person got when they watched something small choose trust in a moment when trust made no sense at all. He pulled out the strips of dried meat from his pack next. The drake sniffed at the first piece carefully, then took it from his fingers with surprising gentleness. Then the second piece. Then the third. It ate slowly at first, then with a little more hunger, as if remembering that it had not eaten in some time. When it was done, Garrett pulled off his heavy canvas jacket and laid it gently over the creature's back. The drake flinched when the fabric touched it, going rigid for one sharp second. Then it relaxed. The shivering slowed. It tucked its head down close to its good wing and let out one long, slow breath. Garrett settled his back against the stone wall nearby and watched the tree lean. The sky darkened. Stars appeared one by one through the gaps in the broken roof above them. The drake slept. Its breathing was quiet and even, and every now and then its good wing shifted slightly, the way sleeping animals move without waking. Garrett did not sleep. He sat with his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the trees and his mind very calm and very focused. Hours passed. The cold crept in from the ground and settled into his bones. He did not move. It was deep in the night when he heard them. Boots. More than one pair. Moving through the undergrowth somewhere to the north, slow and deliberate and careful, the way people moved when they were tracking something and did not want to be heard. There was the occasional low sound of a voice, too distant to make out words, but close enough to tell that whoever was out there was communicating. Coordinating. They were not lost. They were searching. Garrett looked down at the sleeping drake wrapped in his jacket. Then he looked back at the dark line of trees where the sounds were coming from. He did not stand up. He did not call out. He did not run. He simply stayed where he was, between the creature and the trees, and he waited. The boots got closer. Garrett did not move from his spot against the wall. He kept his breathing slow and his body still, the way he had learned to do in tight situations. Moving too early was just as dangerous as moving too late. He had learned that lesson a long time ago and he had not forgotten it. The drake was still sleeping behind him. He could hear its soft, steady breathing just over his shoulder. The small creature had no idea what was coming through the trees. It was warm inside his jacket and full of dried meat and water, and for the first time in what was probably a very long time, it felt safe. Garrett intended to keep it that way. Torchlight flickered between the tree trunks first. Then came the shapes. 4 men stepped out of the tree lean and into the open ruins, each one carrying a weapon. 2 had rifles. 1 carried a long blade at his belt and a torch in his hand. The 4th one, the one walking slightly ahead of the others, was broad and heavy built with a thick beard and cold eyes that moved across the ruins like a man doing inventory. They were not soldiers. Their clothing was wrong for it. Mixed, patched, practical. These were men who worked outside the law and had been doing it long enough that they no longer bothered pretending otherwise. Poachers. The broad man with the beard spotted Garrett almost immediately. He stopped walking. The others stopped behind him. The torchlight pushed the shadows back just enough that both sides could see each other clearly. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then the broad man smiled. It was not a warm smile. "Step aside," he said. His voice was flat and easy, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "We are not here for you. We tracked that creature for 3 days. It belongs to us." Garrett said nothing. He stood up slowly from where he had been sitting, and he placed himself fully between the 4 men and the sleeping drake behind him. He did not raise his rifle yet. He just stood there, straight and quiet, with his eyes on the broad man and his feet planted on the ground. "I said step aside," the broad man repeated. His smile was gone now. No, Garrett said. It was the only word he offered. No explanation attached to it. No argument. No anger in his voice. Just the word, solid and flat, like a stone dropped on a hard floor. The broad man looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the other three. Something passed between them without words. The two men with rifles shifted their grips. Behind Garrett, the drake stirred. It made a small sound, still half asleep, and he heard the soft scrape of its claws against the ground as it lifted its head. Last chance, the broad man said. Garrett said nothing. The first shot came without further warning. It was fast and loud, and the sound of it cracked through the silent ruins like something breaking that could not be fixed. Garrett felt the bullet graze the left side of his upper arm, tearing through the fabric of his shirt and dragging a line of fire across his skin. The impact spun him half a step to the right, but he did not fall. He steadied himself, teeth pressed together against the pain, and stayed standing. He pressed his hand over the wound automatically. And then something happened that made no sense. The burning stopped. Not gradually. Not slowly. It simply stopped, the way a candle flame goes out when you pinch it between two fingers. The pain was there 1 second and gone the next. Garrett pulled his hand away and looked at his arm. The torn fabric was still there, dark with a thin line of blood. But beneath it, the skin was closing. Not slowly healing. Closing. The edges of the wound were drawing together the way a zip closes, smooth and firm, and where the skin sealed itself it looked slightly different from before. Denser. Harder. The faint texture of it had changed. He stared at his own arm. He had no explanation for what he was seeing. Then he felt it. Something pressed against his back, low and firm and warm, just between his shoulder blades. The drake. It was awake now and standing close behind him, and its small claws were pressed flat against his back, not gripping, not scratching, just resting there with a kind of quiet intention that felt deliberate. Felt chosen. The warmth coming from those claws was not normal body warmth. It was deeper than that. It moved through the fabric of his shirt and spread across his back and down his spine like warm water poured slowly over cold stone. Garrett straightened up. The 4 men had gone still. The one who had fired was staring. Even the broad man had taken one small step back without seeming to realize he had done it. Garrett looked down at his hands. His hands were changing. It was subtle at first, easy to miss if you were not paying close attention. But he was paying close attention, and what he saw made the breath move slowly out of him in one long, quiet exhale. The skin across the backs of his hands and along his forearms was shifting. Not painfully. Not violently. It was more like watching frost form on a window, gradual and quiet and certain. Small patches of texture were appearing, faint and close to his natural skin tone, but harder and slightly raised, arranged in the overlapping pattern that he recognized from the drake's own scales. His fingers felt stronger. His grip felt different. Everything felt sharper. The torchlight seemed brighter. The sounds of the forest seemed closer. He could hear the breathing of all 4 men across the ruins. He could hear the heartbeat of the small creature behind him. The broad man found his voice again. "What is he?" one of the others whispered. Not a question directed at anyone. Just words falling out of a frightened mouth. Garrett raised his eyes from his hands and looked at the 4 men. He did not raise his rifle. He did not need to. He simply looked at them, steady and calm and completely unafraid, with something burning quietly behind his eyes that had not been there before. Something old. Something that had no name in any human language but that every living creature understood on instinct. The man with the torch took a step back. Then another. The broad man's jaw was tight. His hand moved toward his weapon, then stopped. His eyes were doing the work that his brain had not caught up with yet, telling him that the thing standing across the ruins from him was not quite the same thing that had been standing there a minute ago. The drake made a sound behind Garrett. Small and low, almost gentle. Garrett did not look away from the men. "Walk away," he said quietly. The broad man stared at him. His radio crackled at his belt. He reached for it slowly, and in the silence of the ruins his voice came out low and tight as he spoke into it. "We need more people," he said. "Bring everyone." The radio crackled once and then went quiet. Garrett heard every word the broad man had spoken into it. He heard the response too, a short and rough confirmation from whoever was on the other end, and the number that followed it made the other three poachers visibly relax, as if backup was the same thing as victory and the distance between the two did not matter at all. Garrett did not relax. He stood where he was, facing the four men, with the drake pressed close against his legs now. The small creature had moved from behind him to beside him sometime in the last minute, and it stood there without making a sound, its amber eyes fixed on the men across the ruins with an expression that was ancient and unreadable and completely calm. The broad man put his radio away. He looked at Garrett with a different kind of expression now. Not the easy confidence from before. Something harder had replaced it, something that was still trying to look like control but had a thin edge of unease running underneath it. "You should sit down and wait," the broad man said. "More men are coming. A lot more. Whatever is happening to you right now, it will not matter when they get here." Garrett said nothing. The warmth in his back was still moving. Still spreading. It had reached his shoulders now and was working its way down through his chest and into his ribs, slow and deep and steady, like roots pushing through soil in the dark. He could feel it changing things as it moved. Not breaking anything. Not forcing anything. Just settling into the spaces that were already there and making them stronger. He looked at his forearms. The scales were more visible now. Still faint, still close to his skin tone, but clearly there, overlapping in neat and deliberate rows from his wrists up toward his elbows. When he turned his arm in the torchlight, they caught the flame the same way the drake's scales did, throwing back a faint shimmer of blue. He pressed his fingers against the scaled skin. It was firm. Dense. It did not feel foreign. It felt like something that had always been underneath the surface and had simply been waiting for the right moment to come through. The drake made a soft sound beside him. And then something happened inside Garrett's mind that he had no words for. It was not a voice. It was not a picture. It was more like a door opening in a room he had not known existed, and on the other side of that door was a feeling that was not his own. Warmth. Recognition. Something that translated roughly into the word safe, though it was larger than that word and older than that word and carried more weight than any single word could hold. It was coming from the drake. Garrett understood then, not with his brain but with something deeper than his brain, what was happening between them. He had heard the word bond used in the old stories that soldiers sometimes told at night when the fire was low and sleep was far away. Stories about humans and creatures forming connections that went beyond the ordinary. He had always listened to those stories the way a person listens to things they find interesting but do not truly believe. Old tales. Campfire words. But standing in the ruins with scales growing on his arms and a drake pressed warm against his leg, he believed every word of every story he had ever heard. The bond was real. It had begun the moment he placed his body between the guns and the small creature. That was the key, he understood now. Not kindness alone. Not the water or the food or the jacket. Those things had mattered, but they were not the thing that opened the door. The door had opened when he stood up and put himself in the path of the bullet without thinking about the cost. That was the ancient law. Willingness without calculation. Protection without condition. A human body offered freely as a shield. When that happened, something in the drake recognized it on a level that had nothing to do with thought. Something old and built into the creature at a depth that no amount of time had touched. And it responded the only way it knew how. It gave back. It shared what it had. Its essence, its strength, its nature began to move into the one who had chosen to stand in front of it. Garrett felt his spine straighten. Not from effort. From something settling into alignment that had been slightly off his entire life. His eyes were different too. He could not see them himself, but he could feel the change in the way the world looked back at him. The torchlight the poachers carried was no longer necessary for him to see by. The shadows between the crumbled walls were not dark anymore. Everything was clear and sharp and layered with detail that his eyes had never been able to pick up before. He could see the sweat on the broad man's forehead. He could see the slight tremor in the hand of the man who had fired at him. He could see all four of them with a clarity that felt less like enhanced sight and more like understanding, like seeing past the surface of a thing and finding the truth underneath it. And the truth underneath these four men was simple. They were frightened. They were holding their ground only because backup was coming, and without that promise they would already be gone. The drake stepped forward. Just one small step, from beside Garrett to just in front of him, and it raised its head and opened its mouth and let out a sound. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was low and resonant and layered in a way that a single creature should not have been able to produce, as if the sound came from several places at once, from the chest and the throat and somewhere deeper than both. It rolled across the ruins like a wave rolling across shallow water, filling every corner and crack. The man with the torch dropped it. He did not mean to. His hand simply opened. The torch hit the ground and rolled against a broken stone and flickered but did not go out. Two of the other men stepped back. Then kept stepping back. Their boots scraped against the rubble and then found the grass at the edge of the ruins, and then they were moving into the tree line without having made a decision to do so. Their bodies had made the decision for them. The broad man stayed. His jaw was tight and his eyes were hard, and he was clearly a person who did not like being made to feel small. But his hand was shaking. He looked at Garrett. At the scales on his arms. At the amber burning steadily in his eyes. At the small drake standing calmly in front of a man who had taken a bullet and not fallen. He picked up the dropped torch. He took one step back. Then another. "They will come," he said. His voice was tight and low. "Dozens of them. And whatever you are becoming, it will not be enough." Then he turned and walked into the trees. Garrett stood in the silence of the ruins and listened to the sound of boots fading into the dark forest. The drake turned and looked up at him. Its amber eyes were steady and warm and patient. Garrett looked down at his hands one more time. Then he picked up his pack. They needed to move. Garrett moved fast. Not the careful, measured pace he had used coming into the ruins. That was patrol speed, built for observation and quiet. This was something different. This was the speed of a person who understood that time had a hard edge on it, and that edge was getting closer with every passing minute. He slung his pack over one shoulder and crouched down beside the drake. The small creature looked up at him without fear, its amber eyes steady and patient in the dark. Garrett hesitated for only a second, then slid both arms carefully underneath the drake's body and lifted it against his chest. The creature was heavier than it looked, solid and dense the way all scaled things tended to be, but the weight felt manageable. More than manageable. He realized with a small and quiet surprise that he could feel the difference in his own strength. His arms held the weight easily, more easily than they should have. The bond was still working. He moved into the trees. The forest closed around him quickly, dark and thick and layered with the smell of pine and wet earth. He did not use a torch. He did not need one. His eyes picked up the shapes of trees and roots and stones with a clarity that should not have been possible in this darkness, everything outlined in faint detail, as if the world had a thin light of its own that only he could see now. He moved north, away from the direction the poachers had gone, cutting deeper into the old part of the forest where the trees grew wider apart and the ground was softer underfoot, and the sound of a large group of men moving would carry further and give him more warning. The drake lay still against his chest. It did not squirm. It did not try to get down. It rested its chin on his forearm and watched the trees passing with calm, half-lidded eyes, and every few minutes it let out a slow breath that Garrett could feel warm against his skin through his shirt. He talked to it quietly as he walked. Not because he expected a response. Just because the silence needed something in it and his own thoughts were too loud and too circular to be useful company. "You picked a bad place to get trapped," he said softly. "Those ruins have been dangerous since before they burned them down." The drake blinked slowly. "You need a name," Garrett said. He thought about it for a few steps. He was not a man who spent a lot of time on decisions like names. He tended to call things what they were and move on. But this felt like it mattered in a way he could not fully explain, as if giving the creature a name was part of something larger, a recognition of what had formed between them in those ruins and what was still forming now. He looked down at it. The dark gray scales. The faint blue shimmer. The quiet, watchful eyes the color of a low flame. "Ash," he said. The drake lifted its head and looked directly at him. Not the way an animal looks at a sound. The way a person looks at someone who has just said something that lands correctly. There was recognition in that look, clear and immediate, and it sent a small and wordless feeling through the bond between them, something that settled in Garrett's chest like a hand placed gently on a shoulder. He understood that feeling without needing to examine it. Ash liked the name. They moved deeper into the forest and Garrett found a place where 3 old trees had grown close enough together that their roots had pushed up from the ground and created a natural low wall on 2 sides. He set Ash down carefully inside this shelter and checked the injured wing. It was still bent, still wrong in its angle, but the swelling around the joint had reduced noticeably. The bond, he realized. The same thing knitting his own skin together was doing something for Ash as well, working in both directions the way a river moves water to both banks. He sat beside Ash and leaned his back against one of the wide trunks. For a few minutes he simply breathed. Through the bond he could feel Ash's emotions sitting alongside his own like a second heartbeat. Tiredness. A deep and animal kind of relief. Trust that was not complicated by thought or condition, just clean and simple and total. Garrett had not felt trusted like that in a long time. Maybe ever. It was a strange thing to receive from a creature that had known him for less than a single night, but it did not feel strange. It felt earned. He felt the exact moment the reinforcements entered the forest. Not through sound. Through Ash. The small drake's head came up sharply. Its body went rigid against the roots. A feeling moved through the bond, not fear exactly, but a heightened and electric awareness, the feeling of prey that has sensed the presence of something large moving in its direction. Garrett was on his feet before the first sound reached his ears. He could hear them now. Many boots. Many bodies moving through undergrowth, not trying to be quiet anymore because they had numbers and numbers made men careless about silence. Torchlight began to appear between the trunks to the south and east, multiple points of orange light spreading out in a wide arc, the shape of a group trying to surround rather than approach from one direction. They were good at this. Garrett looked down at Ash. The drake looked back up at him. Another feeling moved through the bond. Not fear. Something closer to readiness. Something that said, quietly and without drama, that whatever came next, it would be faced together. Garrett stepped out from between the roots. He walked forward into the open space between the trees and he stood there and waited as the torches drew closer and the boots grew louder and the shapes of men began to resolve out of the dark. He counted quickly. 16, maybe more behind the trees. Armed, organized, fanning out to cut off any direction of escape. They stopped when they saw him. A few of them raised weapons immediately. Others hesitated, and Garrett understood why they hesitated. He could not see himself, but he could feel what he had become, and he understood that what they were looking at was not the man who had walked into these woods at the start of the patrol. His forearms were fully scaled now, dark gray with that faint blue shimmer, the same shade as ash. His eyes burned steady amber in the dark, and he knew they were visible from where the men stood because he watched their faces change when they found his gaze. His posture was different. His shoulders carried a different weight. Everything about him said that he had not come out from between those roots to run. The squad commander stepped forward. "Take him down," he said. Weapons came up across the line. Garrett felt something rise in his chest. It came up through the bond, through the place where Ash's essence had been flowing into him since the ruins, and it moved up through his ribs and into his throat, and when it came out of him it was not a word and it was not a shout. It was a sound. Low and deep and layered, the same way Ash's sound in the ruins had been layered, coming from more than one place at once, rolling outward through the trees and the dark in a wave that had no anger in it but had something far more serious than anger. Several of the men stepped back without meaning to. Two of them lowered their weapons without being told. The commander's hand tightened on his rifle. And Garrett looked at him with calm, burning amber eyes and waited to see what he would choose. Nobody moved. The forest held its breath the same way it had when Garrett first walked into the ruins, that pressed and waiting silence that meant something was about to happen and everything alive in the area knew it. The torches the men carried threw unsteady orange light across the trees and the ground and across the face of the thing standing in the open space between them, the thing that had once been a straightforward human soldier on a routine patrol and was now something that did not have a clean name yet. The commander had not lowered his weapon. He was a hard man. Garrett could see that clearly. Not hard in the way that meant cruel, but hard in the way that meant he had been through enough difficult things that his nerve had been tested many times and had not broken. He was the kind of man who stayed when others ran, and he was staying now, jaw set and eyes steady, even though his body was doing small things that told a different story. His weight had shifted back slightly onto his rear foot. His breathing was faster than it should have been for a man standing still. He was afraid. He was choosing not to show it. Garrett respected that, in a distant and quiet way. But it did not change anything. He stood without speaking, without raising his rifle, without moving toward the line of men at all. He simply existed in that space in front of them and let what he had become do the work that words would have done poorly anyway. The amber light in his eyes was steady and even. The scales on his forearms caught the torchlight and threw it back in faint blue. His breathing was slow. His hands were open at his sides. He was not performing calm. He was calm. The bond had done that too. Ash's nature was deep in him now, layered through his chest and his spine and his thoughts, and Drake's, he understood without being told, did not waste energy on fear that served no purpose. They were old creatures. Old enough that panic had been replaced long ago by something more useful. Stillness. Patience. The knowledge that presence alone was often enough. 3 more men lowered their weapons. They did not look at each other when they did it. They did not ask permission. Their arms simply came down, slowly and without drama, the way heavy things settle when the effort of holding them up becomes more than the reason for holding them. The commander noticed. His jaw tightened further. He took one step forward, away from his line, planting himself in the open space between his men and Garrett with the clear intention of showing his squad that the thing in front of them was not what their instincts were telling them it was. "You are one man," the commander said. His voice was firm and even. "Whatever is happening to you, you are still one man. And there are 18 of us." Garrett looked at him. 17, he said quietly. "One of yours left while you were talking." The commander did not look back to check. He kept his eyes on Garrett, but something shifted in them, a hairline crack in the surface of his certainty. "Step down," he said. "Step down and we walk away. You have my word." "You came here for the Drake," Garrett said. "The Drake is not yours. It was never yours. Walk away and this ends here." The commander stared at him for a long moment. Then he raised his weapon and fired. The shot was clean and direct and would have put a man on the ground under normal circumstances without much argument. But these were not normal circumstances, and Garrett was not a normal man anymore. The bullet struck him in the chest, center mass, exactly where the commander had aimed. The sound of it was sharp and loud in the quiet forest. Garrett rocked back half a step. Then he steadied. He looked down at his chest. The fabric of his shirt had torn slightly at the point of impact. Underneath it, the skin was unmarked. Not healing. Already whole. The scales had spread further than he had realized, covering his chest and the upper part of his stomach in the same dense and overlapping pattern that covered his forearms, and the bullet had not pierced them. It lay on the ground at his feet, flattened slightly out of shape, the way a bullet looks when it has hit stone. The forest went completely silent. Nobody breathed. Garrett raised his eyes from the ground back to the commander's face. The commander was staring at the bullet on the ground. Then at Garrett's chest. Then at his face. The hardness in his expression was still there, but it was cracking now along every edge, splitting apart the way old wood splits when the cold finally gets deep enough into the grain. "One chance," Garrett said. His voice was quiet and even and carried no anger in it at all. "That is all I am offering. Walk away." The commander stood very still for a long moment. Then he lowered his weapon. He lowered it slowly, deliberately, the way a man lowers something he has decided he will not be using again tonight. He looked at Garrett for one more second with an expression that was complicated and difficult and had no single feeling in it that could be named on its own. Then he turned. "Pull back," he said to his men. "All of you. Now." Nobody argued. They went quickly and quietly, the torches moving back through the trees the way the lights of boats move away from a dark shore, shrinking and dimming until the forest swallowed them entirely and the sound of their boots faded to nothing and then to less than nothing. Garrett stood in the silence they left behind. He stood there for a while, just listening to the forest come back to itself, the small sounds returning one by one, insects and the distant movement of water and the soft settling of branches in a light wind. Then he turned and walked back to the shelter between the roots. Ash was standing. Not lying down, not curled against the roots. Standing, fully upright, with both wings spread slightly at its sides. Both wings. The injured one was straight and even and held with the same easy confidence as the other, the joint that had been bent and swollen now smooth and correct, the scales over it unbroken and whole. Fully healed. Ash looked at Garrett with those steady amber eyes, and the feeling that came through the bond was simple and large and warm, too large for any single word to carry properly but closest, perhaps, to the word home. Garrett crouched down. Ash stepped forward, placed one small clawed foot on his knee, and climbed. Up his arm, across his shoulder, and then settled there with its tail curling lightly around the back of his neck for balance and its chin resting at the edge of his jaw. Its scales were warm against his skin. Its weight on his shoulder felt natural, the way things feel when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. Garrett stood up slowly. He looked out through the trees in the direction the men had gone. Then in the other direction, where the forest opened up eventually into wider land and longer roads and a world that did not yet know what had happened in these ruins on this night. He began to walk. Behind him, the ruins were empty and cold and quiet. Ahead of him, the forest stretched on in the dark. Ash rode on his shoulder without sound, watching the trees pass with calm and ancient eyes. They walked together. In the weeks that followed, stories began to move through the towns and outposts at the edge of the Aldenmere woods. Soldiers told them first, then traders, then ordinary people who had heard them from someone who had heard them from someone else. The details changed a little with each telling, the way details always do. But the shape of the story stayed the same. A man who stood between guns and a small creature. A man who took a bullet and did not fall. A man who walked out of the dark woods with scales on his arms and fire in his eyes and a drake on his shoulder, and who had looked at 18 armed men and offered them one chance and meant it. Nobody knew his name at first. They gave him one of their own. They called him the Protector. And somewhere in the deep forest, walking a road that had no clear end, Garrett heard none of it. He was not interested in what people called him. He was interested in the road ahead and the weight on his shoulder and the steady warmth of the bond that moved between him and Ash like a current that would not stop. He walked on. That was enough.